I had to make doors for my woodshed, 14 doors to be specific. Each had a rectangular frame made of 2x3 studs. Each corner of the frame was joined with a lap joint for strength. So that's 14 doors with 8 half laps each, which came to 112 half laps plus a few more on the larger doors. My impulse was to crawl into a corner and curl up in a fetal position, but I decided it would be more productive to see if this would be an opportunity. I figured I would test 2 methods for cutting half laps. By the way, if you're wondering why my woodshed had 14 doors, you should check out my epic woodshed build, parts 1 and 2. I'll put links for these videos in the description. Just to review, a half lap is a notch cut into the end or middle of a board. The depth of the notch is half the thickness. When you put 2 of the notches together, they form a joint that's the same thickness as the original board. The really traditional way to cut a half lap is to use a handsaw, like a Japanese pull saw, to cut a notch. I don't even want to think about how long it'd take to cut 112 of those. My project was a bit more challenging because my 2x3s were up to 7 feet long. That limited which tools I could use and how I could use them. For example, people sometimes use a dado blade with a table saw to cut half laps. You can get away with this if you're cutting a short board using a crosscut sled, but I wouldn't want to try this with a 7-foot 2x3. It'd be awkward and dangerous trying to hold the end of a 7-footer on a little sled. I decided it would be safer to use my radial arm saw. With that tool, the workpiece remained stationary so I could support the overhanging 2x3 with an outboard stand. Now, about dado blades, I find these things pretty sketchy to begin with, and I really wouldn't feel comfortable using a dado stack on my radial arm saw. My dado blade is pretty grabby, and it would probably send the motor assembly surging forward, so not the safest situation. I decided to stick with a general purpose blade. So that's what I'm calling method A, using a radial arm saw with a general purpose blade set to half the depth of the workpiece. A general purpose blade is only 1/8 inch kerf, so you have to make a lot of cuts to hog out the half lap. It's way too tedious trying to make overlapping 1/8 inch cuts. A better alternative is to make closely spaced but non-overlapping cuts, which leaves a bunch of thin wafers. You then use a hammer to knock out the wafers. You're still left with a jagged surface, which you need to clean up somehow. I'll talk about that in a bit. Let's take a look at method B, using a router instead of a radial arm saw. I used a plunge router with a 3/4 inch straight bit. In theory, you could cut a half lap on the end of a short board using a router table and a miter gauge, but with a 7-foot 2x3, you run into the same problems you would cutting a half lap with a table saw and a crosscut sled. To get around this, I designed a simple jig that can support my router on the end of a long workpiece. Basically, the jig consists of 2 short pieces of 2x3 held together with a piece of fence board. There's a gap in the middle where you put the end of the workpiece. One of the supports is longer than the other. You clamp the longer leg against the workpiece, and you use a deep throat clamp to clamp the fence board like this. Before you cut your actual workpiece, you insert a sacrificial board and make a shallow pass with the router along the plank edge, cutting partway into the 2x3 supports. This creates reference marks that let you know where the router will cut. It turned out that 3/4 of an inch depth was too much of a bite to take all at once. It worked much better using the router's step tour to take progressively deeper cuts. I put up with this for about 2 or 3 half laps. It was obvious making multiple passes was way too slow. I was ready to abandon the jig idea, and then I came up with an alternative approach. I would use the radial arm saw to make relief cuts, and then I would clear out the remaining wood using the router at the full 3/4 inch depth. Now, I know what you're thinking. If you're going to use the radial arm saw to make relief cuts, why don't you just make a few more passes and knock out the wafers with a hammer and skip the router entirely, right? That's what I thought at first, but my opinion changed as I got more practice. It came down to these 3 steps. First, I made relief cuts. Then I attached the 2 clamps. Finally, I ratted out the waste material. So how does this compare with the cross-cut and hammer method? Actually, it's cross-cutting, hammering, and cleanup. So again, there were 3 steps. I experimented with different ways to clean up the surface after hammering. The fastest and cleanest method was to run the workpiece sideways under the radial arm saw blade. Here's the process in real time. Making the crosscuts was really fast. Hammering out the wafers was surprisingly slow, however. Sure, it takes just a few whacks to chip out most of the material, but you're left with a pretty jagged surface, which needs more work in order to use the sideways blade trick. I found it necessary to go back with chisel to clean up the surface after removing the wafers with a hammer. So really there were 4 steps. When you add those together, the total time for the crosscut and hammer method was actually pretty close to the crosscut and route method. How about accuracy with the crosscut and hammer method? With 2 short workpieces, the accuracy was excellent, maybe a bit more consistent than with the other method. Longer pieces, however, magnified inaccuracies caused by bends or twists in the workpiece. A crooked 2x3 wouldn't sit flat on the saw table, so the cut would come out all cattywampus. So the crosscut and hammer method was not always as accurate as you might assume. As far as getting a clean cut is concerned, running the workpiece sideways under the circular saw blade yielded a smooth and flat surface comparable to the surface cut by the router bit. So what's the verdict? I predicted the crosscut and hammer method would win hands down, but the results were a lot closer than I expected. If I were cutting half laps in, say, short pieces, I would probably stick with the crosscut and hammer method because it feels like a lot less work. However, if I'm cutting long work pieces, as I was with the woodshed project, I would probably go with the crosscut and router method. So there you go. 2 pretty good methods to cut fast and reasonably accurate half laps. Thanks for watching.